Here's how to get older without getting better. Keep relearning the same lesson. If you keep making the same mistake over and over, the mistake isn't the problem, you are.
So I define learning by same condition, new behavior. And so when you go to a video game and you battle through the level and you battle the boss, if you keep doing the same thing to the boss and you keep losing, then you have not learned because you have the same condition and the same behavior. And so I often say that, like, for anyone who's listening to this podcast, if the goal is to get better and you're like, man, I really want to learn something from this podcast. If you listen to this podcast and then you're in the same exact conditions as you were before, and then you do not change your behavior, you learned nothing. And so using that definition has at least allowed me to change my behavior faster, which then goes into rate of learning, which I define as intelligence. And so a lot of people are like, man, he's so smart, but he just doesn't. It's like, well, then if he doesn't change his behavior and he's in the same conditions, he's a dummy. He's not that smart. And so if you are trying to battle the same boss over and over again and you don't change what you're doing and the boss keeps beating you, then it's not the game's problem. It's your problem. You are the problem. And I think that's like, if you continue, I talked about, obviously I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs, but I usually do this when I have a crowd. It's like, hey, raise your hand if you work all the hours of the day. And a lot, most of the crowd raises their hand. I say, okay, who here has been stuck at the same revenue level for 6 months or more? And then I say, keep the hands up. And like, honestly, most of the time, the same hands are raised. I say, you're doing the wrong shit. Like, if you put all your inputs and the outputs haven't changed, then you have the same condition and the same behavior. And so you have learned nothing. And so that has always just been my reframe. And so over time, if you're moving up in entrepreneurship, you're moving up in career, your behavior should change because it means you've learned.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. And it's the same with memory. It's literally the way that memory works. The best way to work out how the human memory system works is repeated recall, not repeated exposure, right? You have to drag it out of memory and use it, not just see it a million times. And this is kind of the same thing with the lesson. You can listen to any of the podcasts that exist on the internet, or the ones that we've done, or the ones that you love, or whatever. And if you don't apply anything, it's a waste of time.
Yeah, when I was getting started in my entrepreneurial journey, and I would say this is like this was when I was an entrepreneur, right? Like I hadn't quit my job yet. I started reading all these self-help books. And I remember reading, like, it was probably like my 10th book in a row. And I realized that the words in that book contradicted like the second self-help book that one was like, it's all about goals. The other one's like, it's all about taking, steps or whatever it was, right? And I all of a sudden I was like, my life is the same. I've read all these books, but I still literally live in the exact same condo in Baltimore doing the same job. Like nothing has changed. And so I just made the commitment that whatever the next book that I was going to read, I would just not read another book until I'd done everything in that book. And that's when I quit my job and I did a whole bunch of other things. And I've actually more or less stuck with that in terms of like when I read books or even listen to podcasts, I usually do it with an intention to get something out of it. And I usually have notes up. And so my intake on information, because I get asked a lot, I'm sure you do. Like I actually don't read that much. I definitely don't read nonfiction. I read like fantasy every once in a while.
Red Rising, baby.
That's right. But it's because usually I get overwhelmed with the amount of things I would have to do. And so I'm like, I don't need more information. I'm good. Like I could read a chapter and be like, all right, that's it. It'll take me 2 weeks to do this. And so then like the rest of the time is doing that. And so
how do you ensure that the things that you're reading are giving you good advice? Because if you didn't move on before you took 2 weeks to go and do the thing, but the thing was dog shit, you've spent 2 weeks going backward.
So I would make the argument that I wouldn't have gone backwards because I would have gained the experience. And so I would have more context to know what the second thing was going to be. And that's just kind of like the trial by fire, learning through iteration. And I think I tend to do more of that.
Sort of a win or learn philosophy.
Yeah. And I would say that like there are entrepreneurs who are definitely like super, super duper planners. And there are entrepreneurs who are more like, let's just move and break shit and we'll figure it out. I tend to be really this on the micro in terms of like move shit and break, like we'll figure it out as we go. And I just tend to be a planner only in the big, like very grand, like what do I really want to do in 10 years? But the majority of the time it's like, let's see. And we'll learn. I've learned so much of the content that I have comes from just fucking up in business. And people are like, this is such original content. I was like, this is just because that's what my life was. I made this mistake and it didn't work. But I said this one thing one time and then all these people bought and I was like, ooh, how do I do that again? And so like it was always through iteration. And I've read all these books, but there's just knowing how, knowing that and knowing how. Like knowing that maybe this works, maybe. But once you do it, it's a different type of learning where, at least for me, it's been that way. You could read 100 books on sales, but when you take your first cold call, all of that goes out the window because you actually have to sell.
This is related to something I wrote last week. Don't be so worried about people who imitate your work. They only know the what, but not the why. If you stopped being creative, so would they. A photocopier isn't an artist, even if it can recreate the Mona Lisa.
I love that because at the end of it, like you are source in that situation, and so everyone is there for like a subset of you, and they require you to live. You don't require them. And the equal opposite is, I think we should be more fearful of when everyone stops copying you. Like the day that no one copies you is far, far more frightening than the day everyone's copying you.
Yeah. Jimmy Carr refers to China as a cover band. You know, it's like they're the cover band of the Beatles. And he says, you know, they're good and in many ways they're able to produce things at more scale and so on and so forth, but they're not driving the innovation forward in that same way.
Yeah, the idea of getting upset about people copying is just ridiculous. Like, yeah, that's all.
But you understand why it's painful, right? If someone's gone through, okay, let's test and test and test and test and test, and then finally find a particular formula that works, and then 10 people downstream get the benefit of this hard, laborious, effortful, late night grind and iteration, and they just got to be like, oh, that thing.
Yeah, So I think that like they'll be able to copy what they can see, but they won't be able to copy what they can't see, which is understanding why each of those pieces are in place. And when something changes in the future, they won't be able to iterate from there because they don't know why it was there in the first place.
Why.
Right. And so like, I mean, I've obviously dealt this with in a business context where like real dollars are at stake. And so like in the gym world, you know, gym launch, for those who don't know, I had a big licensing company. We had 5,000 locations. And anyways, so we had basically business processes that we would, you know, iterate and figure out why this worked. And so then I used to keep a list of names, and then it got too long and tiresome to keep the names of all the people who tried to take the stuff and then sell it as their own. I say their names every night before I go to bed. You think I don't remember you? I remember all of you. And so none of them 10 years later are still around. And none of them even came to a 10th of the size of Gym Launch. And it was because it wasn't theirs. Like the person that I would be far more afraid of, somebody who comes out with a significantly better system than what we had to help gyms make more money and help their clients more. But like to this day, like there still isn't one, and Gym Launch is still the category king in that industry. And so it's like and that's because we were talking about this earlier, everything is in R&D for us. And so we actually we're the only licensing company that had an R&D department, and we would test. We call them plays, but we test plays every 14 days. And so we'd spend 50 or 100 grand on just a test. We'd be like, all right, let's test this new marketing campaign. Or we'd say, hey, let's test this new high ticket sales process. Or hey, what if we tried to sell memberships via chat? Let's just give it a shot, see what happens. And honestly, 70% of the time, it was worse than the control. Like it didn't work as well. And what we would do is we'd present it to the licensees and say, hey guys, guess what we just spent 50 grand on that you don't have to spend money on? Look at the results of this sell membership
Total
via
dog
chat.
shit.
Yeah. The thing is that most people are actually really happy to know that it didn't work, because it felt like they were scratching an itch. They're like, oh great, I don't have to do that one. Like someone did that test for me. So anyways, all that to say, unless you have that trail of bodies behind you that led you to figure out this one thing, when there is a kink in the system because some external condition changes, which it always will, they then don't know, which means you're always still going to be ahead.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, because if you understand the physics of the system, if you understand the dynamics of why you're doing the things that you're doing and something changes, you can respond. But it goes back to people with high standards. You have to presume that you win in the weeds.
Yeah.
You have to presume that you win in the weeds. And if you do, and if you're continuing to be this close to it, as soon as things change, you go, that's interesting. Why has that happened? And that then allows you to continue to iterate.
And you see it because you're in the weeds, right? Somebody who's all the way zoomed out, just like, copy paste that. They're like, they're late because they have to see that it's working consistently. So they're already 3-6 months behind. Then they start trying to figure out how to implement it. And then they start implementing it. And then what they don't see is the things that made the conditions that made it work to begin with. And so like, if you just assume that you're always in the lead, then it means sure, 2nd through 10th place will always copy number 1, but to the victor go the spoils. And so you will, no one gives a shit who is 4th place at the Olympics.